This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Hello and welcome to Heritage Matters, a program brought to you by the Southern Heritage Trust and sponsored by Heritage New Zealand. I'm Dougal Stevenson. In this program, Gregor Campbell reports on the reasons for massive exhumations in Dunedin's Southern Cemetery. Bill Southworth has the story about the so-called 10-pound Poms who immigrated to New Zealand. And we finish with an item from Gregor about the trick played on a visiting cricket team. In the 19th century, there were many deaths amongst the hundreds of Chinese who'd come to seek their fortunes on our goldfields. They all wanted their remains to be sent back to China, and a Dunedin entrepreneur attempted to solve the problem for them. This report from Gregor Campbell.
The following story comes from 120 years ago and contains the racial attitudes of its day. Heritage Matters reports these attitudes, but in no way do we agree with them. In October 1902, there were strange goings-on in Dunedin's Southern Cemetery. Graves were being opened, the remains removed, and taken away to be boxed up. It was a practice which had not occurred for 2 decades, so naturally it seemed unusual. The Evening Star investigated. Disinterment of Chinese. A visit to the Dunedin storehouse. 300 already received. On the banks of the Kaikorai stream, midway between Burnside and Messrs Ross and Glendenning's factory, stands an unassuming shed of galvanised iron. This is where the bodies of the Chinese who are being disinterred are stored till they are removed to the land of their fathers. The approach is along a road knee-deep in ruts and dry weather and mud and wet, the improvised mortuary being in the centre of a big field. To look in the door, unaware of what was going on, one would never guess it. 4 or 5 business-like Chinamen, each smartly hammering and screwing away at long boxes, a double tier of the same along the walls, with the fantastic hieroglyphics of the Celestial painted at the end of each box, and a double-decked pile at one end of the shed. That is all one sees. But in the building, which is about 20 feet by 60 in breadth and length, and by about 7 feet high in the walls, are stored at the present time the remains of some 300 Chinamen. The collection has been going on almost unobserved since last April, and all that time the workmen have been busily engaged in packing up their deceased countrymen into boxes made of kauri of 1.5 inch thickness. There is not the least sign of odour, unless maybe it is either from the damp ground or the seed packing or the faint smell of burnt incense. These are the remains of certain Chinamen who have died in the colony during the past 20 years in the Otago, Canterbury and Auckland provinces. 20 years ago, a similar exhumation was made in New Zealand, and last year, a general disinterment of Chinese took place in New South Wales. It is necessary for the peace of mind of the families of the deceased that they should be taken to the home of their ancestors, and a society called the Chong Shin Tong, which, being translated, infers to some extent a philanthropic institution which sees to the interests of the poor, undertakes to see the bodies returned to their native soil from New Zealand. Of this society, Mr. Kampoi Suhoi is the president and Mr. Su Shi the secretary. Their philanthropic work only applies to the former residents of this Pongyi and Far Yep districts, adjacent to Canton, and in many cases work is done for a merely nominal fee, the rich men paying more than the poor. The Chinese are the most intensely patriotic nation in the world, and to allow their poorer brethren to have quiet and decent sepulture in their own villages, the richer sacrifice to the poorer. The enterprise involves a large sum of £5,000, which will be the cost of their exhumation, carriage to China, and reburial there, the average cost for each corpse being about £20. This average includes the exhumation of the body, the enclosure in a special coffin, and the reburial. Otago will provide the greatest number of corpses, our quota being about 290, which is inclusive of Southland. Westland will contribute 170, Wellington 40, Auckland 12 and Canterbury 7, a total of between 500 and 600. There are 3 collecting centres, Dunedin, Greymouth and Wellington. The main centre is the local one, and Canterbury, Auckland and Southland have sent theirs to the local depot. The arrangements for the removal are complete. On October 11, the steamer Rimu will call at Greymouth to load the coffins prepared for transit, and coming to Dunedin will take on board the local cargo. They are to be taken by dray to Burnside, and thence by rail to Port Chalmers, where the Rimu takes them aboard. She then sails direct to Wellington on October 18 and transships there to the steamer Ventnor, which has been specially chartered by the Society for the purpose. The Ventnor sails direct to Hong Kong from Wellington on October 25 and, we believe, will distribute the bodies at their port to their different owners. There have been protests in some parts of the colony over the exhumation of these bodies, but as far as Dunedin is concerned, there seems to have been little to complain about. The collecting of the bodies began at the commencement of April last, and for several months thereafter, the exhumation in the city's cemeteries was carried on almost unnoticed. We understand the Chinese have a special permit from the Colonial Secretary empowering them to exhume the bodies from the cemeteries between the hours of 12 midnight and 12 noon on certain days. Further, that while the disinterment is proceeding, none but those engaged are allowed within the cemetery. Wherefore, it would seem that if any shocked European has penetrated to any such cemetery, he has himself alone to blame, and the Chinese have the right to expel him from the cemetery. However, we are assured that the most rigid carefulness has been observed everywhere. The method of procedure would seem to bear out this care. Immediately the bodies are removed from the earth, they are put in special zinc receptacles already placed alongside the grave, and the lids are soldered down by a plumber on the spot, carbolic acid being freely used when necessary. Then they are removed to the store, and all traces of the work cleared off by 12 men. This has been the procedure at Dunedin, Invercargill, Oropuki, Gore, Alexandra, Queenstown, Clyde, Tuapeka, Naseby, Oamaru, Arrowtown, Ophir, and elsewhere in the province, and the plumber, a European, has toured the colony doing the work at every place. The persons engaged seem to have suffered no infection, nor carried it to others during the period of exhumation. However much ground for complaint there may have been in the north, there appears to have been none in Dunedin. There certainly was none this morning when our representative paid an unexpected visit to the storehouse with Inspector Bain of the Taieri County Council. Everything was clean and tidy in the little shed, and during the best part of the 2 hours spent there, nothing could be smelt or noticed in any way objectionable. Mr. Bain says that he has had no cause for complaint during the 6 months in which the work has been proceeding, and he expresses himself as very pleased with the way in which it has been carried out. A curious sidelight on this matter is observable at the shed. It is part of the religious ceremony of the Chinese to place edibles and drinkables with tapers and incense near the corpse, so that his spirit may not be weary nor uneasy in the darkness, nor an hungered. Twice or thrice daily, tiny cups of China tea are placed at the foot of the dead for the delectation of his faithful ghost. Likewise at night, tapers, Roman candles and other similar ceremonial lights are lit for the said ghost's benefit. The European is inclined to be irreverently funny at the Oriental's expense, but a more or less true yarn is being circulated against one European. 'Tis said, he asked, the weird and venerable celestial in charge of the religious duties, being some 70 years of age, he is inappropriately called Young Dick, why he left the tea, etc. Him no come out drink, Dick. The ancient one smiled and answered, you put him flour on English glaive. Him come out smell? Young Dick is a very venerable man, worthy of the priestly function he exercises. Clad in soil-besmirched moleskins, hitched up by a worn strap, a blue flannel singlet showing the yellow parched skin, with a worn Guernsey coat outside and a hoary cap covering the scanty grey hair, young Dick is a weird, character study. The SS Ventnor sailed for Hong Kong the following October. The ship struck a rock near Cape Egmont and made for the Hokianga harbour. Almost 24 hours after striking, the Ventnor went down with the loss of 13 crew in 147 metres of water. It was the largest ship yet wrecked off the New Zealand coast. No remains of the cargo were recovered except those which were cast up on beaches by the waves. Local iwi, Te Roroa and Te Raroa, buried the remains in their urupa. 100 years later, in 2007, the care of the iwi was recognised by descendants of the Chinese miners, and memorials to the men constructed. The Ventnor was found in 2012 and designated a National Heritage Site. In 2021, a public memorial listing the names of those lying in the Ventnor was unveiled at Opanoni. It also gives thanks to Te Roroa, Te Raroa, and the local people for their care of the remains which had arrived those long years ago. Local MP, Calvin Davis, said to the descendants of the Ventnor passengers, "Your ancestors lie with our ancestors in this soil. There is no difference. They lie with us. They are at home." As part of the unveiling, a white lion was used for the lion dance and then burned as an offering to the heavens. It was a New Zealand first.
Mr. Kampoi Suhoi had also proved to be a man of great vision. He came up with a solution of how to get gold out of Otago's deep riverbeds. Gregor Campbell again.
Choi Suhoi was born in a farming village north of Guangdong in Guangdong province and arrived in Dunedin around 1868, having dug for gold in California and Victoria. He opened a store in Dunedin in 1869 and prospered. One of his investments was a claim in the lower Shotover River named Big Beach. Surface gold was good, but more was there, inaccessible in the waterlogged gravel. One day, while watching the Otago Harbour Board's bucket dredge at work, he had an idea. What if you could put a bucket dredge onto Big Beach? It would need to be built in Dunedin, of course, and transported to the beach to be assembled. It would need the equipment on board to process the gravel and save the gold. It would cost a small fortune, but could make a big one. A group of Dunedin businessmen were persuaded to invest, and the dredge was ready to begin work at the end of 1888. Although the river's winter drop in water level hampered the initial dredging, there was a sensation when it was reported in April 1889 that the dredge had recovered 40 pounds worth of gold in one day. Other dredge designs had been tried. Even a mining submarine had been built in Dunedin to try and access the river gravels. But this one seemed to work, and work at a profit. Thus began Otago's dredging boom, the last phase of the gold rush years. In 1900, there were 228 dredgers at work, making fortunes for investors and good money for crews. In a time of global depression at the end of the 1800s, gold dredgers were an economic godsend for Dunedin industry. Dunedin dredgers were sold all over the world, as far away as Canada and Siberia. Over its lifetime, the Suhoi dredge won 17,000 ounces of gold, worth over $63 million today. The most successful dredge of them all, the Lady Ranfurly, took the record for a week's dredging of more than 1,700 ounces of gold, these days worth over $7 million. It worked the Clutha Gravels for 30 years and today lies under the waters of Lake Dunstan. Choi Suhoi died in 1901 and was buried in Dunedin's Southern Cemetery. A year or so later, his remains were disinterred and sent to China with those of 498 others in the ill-fated SS Ventnor, which sank off the Hokianga Heads. Although large sums of money were offered to whoever could recover his bones so that his spirit could inhabit his home village, they remain under the waters of the Tasman Sea. And I am the dredged up from somewhere, Gregor Campbell, for Heritage Matters.
And on a personal note, My great-grandfather, Isaac Stevenson, was a builder of many gold dredges. He was a partner, in fact the founding partner, of Stevenson and Cook, the historic Port Chalmers shipbuilding firm, which made numerous gold dredges for buyers both here and overseas. In the 1950s and 60s, there were several waves of immigrants to New Zealand. There were the Poles, the Dutch, the Hungarians, and the people from the UK. The latter were sometimes referred to as £10 Poms, as most of their fare was paid for by our government. Initially, at least for some, it wasn't always straightforward adjusting to some of our ways. This report from Bill Southworth.
Today, New Zealand has a flood of new people entering the country. Over 60 years ago, that was not so common. But what we know as £10 Poms took advantage of heavily subsidised fares to chance their luck in this country. In New Zealand House in London, they were given a rosy description of life here, and so looked forward to their new adventure. One of them was Pauline, a young Londoner who came here with her fiancé Peter. After a long flight in a propeller-driven plane, which made many stops along the way, they arrived in Auckland. The cold temperature on that day didn't seem to accord with the South Seas paradise they'd been expecting.
How could that be? We were in New Zealand. It was June. I don't remember much about Auckland, except we were taken into the city for the day. Everything was shut. It was Saturday. But there were some young women about, dressed as though they were going to school in the 1930s. I'd seen such in girls' annuals. They wore black box-pleated gym slips tied with a sash around the middle and thick black stockings. I discovered they were off to play basketball. Later, I also discovered that New Zealanders were very keen on playing sports. After the gruelling days of flying, some of us were subjected to the overnight train to Wellington. On the platform in Auckland, someone advised me to hire a pillow. It would cost 6p. I couldn't think for the life of me why I would need a pillow, but it did turn out to be most essential. The seats were wooden, no padding. The loco puffed away through a very long night, and being dark I saw none of the landscape. I remember stopping, probably in Taumarunui, where I was given a cup of tea and a meat pie. My stomach heaved. The thought of a meat pie in the middle of the night was just too much. We arrived in Wellington, dazed and extremely weary. Waiting on the platform was Peter's sister, her husband and 3 children. Jim gave us a short tour round the city. He was a born and bred Wellingtonian and was so proud to show us the largest wooden building in the Southern Hemisphere. Even though it was Sunday, I still wondered where all the people were. In 1960, the entire population of New Zealand was just over 2 million, whereas by comparison, London alone was 8 million. Of course, I didn't know that then. Peter stayed with his sister and her family, and I had been found a place in a shared house with 4 other girls, all migrant Brits who had had the luxury of travelling by sea. I was fortunate, though, as I had been spared the experience of staying in the hostel, which I was told was not comfortable. Thankfully, we arrived on the Sunday of Queen's birthday weekend, so at least I had the Monday to rest up. On Tuesday, I was instructed to report to the migration office in town. I went by tram and worried about getting my stiletto heels stuck in the tram lines. The girls in the house share gave me warning, as it seems they had broken the heels of several pairs of shoes. I was taken to my allotted job, to which I was contracted for 2 years. Breaking the contract meant paying back the cost of the fare. I was taken to the top floor of Anvil House, a tall modern building built in the 50s. It was a big office with wonderfully large windows that let in so much light, even though it was winter, very different from the poky, dark office I had worked in London. How was I ever going to focus on work with such a glorious view to look out on? I was told to do something with invoices, which remained a mystery, but I guess I couldn't have made too many mistakes, as I was never growled at. It all seemed very casual. Despite the usual office dress code, everyone was called by their first names, even the boss. Despite the lack of formality, I was lonely. At break times, I sat on my own in the canteen, waiting politely to be invited to join a table, while my co-workers probably thought I was a stuck-up Pom who didn't want to mix. We assume some cultures are the same, but the nuances of difference can result in much misunderstanding. One day in the farmer's department store, the sales assistant, hearing my accent, asked me if I was from back home. I was excited. Maybe she too was from London. When I asked her what part of England she was from, she was horrified. No, she was a born and bred New Zealander. I soon learned the majority of New Zealanders then called England home, regardless of their background. I phoned home once a year, usually at Christmas, but made sure I booked the call weeks ahead lest I should miss out. The expensive call lasted 3 minutes and usually involved a lot of shouting as the line was very crackly. The precious 3 minutes mostly involved a conversation about the weather. However, it was reassuring to hear familiar voices. I gradually adapted to my new life, but it was a surprise to discover there was also a housing shortage in New Zealand, with very high rents if you were fortunate enough to find somewhere. We got married, as did Ernie and Phil. They managed to find a damp, run-down tiny flat, and we shared a house with another couple. One of the girls from the house share also married. It was an old house with scrim walls and lots of old plumbing. Nothing like the house we were led to believe we would get to live in. New Zealand House seemed a long way away, and not only in miles. We had picnics around the Wellington Bays with Ernie and Phil, but eventually when the 2 years were up and they had managed to save enough money, we waved goodbye to them and their baby as their boat pulled away from the Wellington harbour back home. They were very homesick and missed their families. Like newcomers to many countries, us 10-pound Poms were not popular. The usual issues: we were taking jobs, houses, and many of the agitators in the unions were Poms, and it was said we moaned too much. It wasn't unusual to hear the phrase, "bash a Pom a day." I was sensitive to this vitriol and took it personally. Initially, I found it difficult to make friends, as I was not interested in sports or joining sports clubs, which seemed to be the dominant place to socialise. Women weren't welcomed in bars. The pubs with 6 o'clock closing was for the blokes rushing off as soon as work was done for the day. What was in the small brown cases they carried? Flagons of beer to keep them going through the evening. In the early days, we were occasionally invited to a Pavs, Savs and bring a plate party in someone's home. I continued feeling unhappy and isolated. It was a long time before I was able to afford a car and learn to drive. I had 2 babies and was stranded in a Wellington suburb which had very little public transport. Then, like many who had missed out on a decent schooling, I took advantage of second chance education that was becoming available to adults. I gained GCEs with the correspondence school and went on to being an extramural student at Massey University, and eventually had a career in primary school teaching. I made friends with New Zealanders, many who remain close friends today. I took out New Zealand citizenship and was then eligible for a New Zealand passport. As my sons grew up, I began to travel, trips to Australia to see where my grandmother had grown up, and various Pacific islands that had connections with the children I worked with. I even managed a trip back to England to visit my sister, but this time in a comfortable jet aircraft, not a noisy prop that continually had engine trouble and leaked oil. I left New Zealand to travel which included opportunities to spend extended time in the States. My 2 sons embarked on the ritual overseas trip like many other young New Zealanders. The wanderlust for adventure, or perhaps the search for something intangible, kept me restless. I've been back to visit my New Zealand friends many times and have been able to travel around and see this glorious country more than I was able to when I lived there. Now in my 80s, I am settled back in London. Would I prefer to be in New Zealand or stay here? I don't know. But I do know that New Zealand had a huge impact on who I am today. My Kiwi accent isn't that strong anymore, but in London I'm often asked if I'm a New Zealander. I had the adventures that I dreamed of in my youth, and on my return visits to New Zealand I get a warm buzz when the agent at the arrivals hall sees my passport and says, "Welcome home."
You've been listening to Pauline, a 10-pound Pom who came here 60 years ago.
And we finish with a story from Gregor Campbell about how an Otago cricket team wreaked its revenge on another team after being beaten by them.
Practical jokes are nothing new in the world, and in these days are greatly aided by technology. 140 years ago, the technology was simpler. A paintbrush could suffice, as reported in the Otago Witness in March 1882. A practical joke of an unusual nature was perpetrated at Kelso the other day. It appears that a return match was being played there between the Tapanui and Kelso cricket clubs. Most of the Tapanui players made the journey on horseback and, on arrival at their destination, turned their horses out in a small paddock near the scene of action. It was rather late before the match was concluded, and the players, very naturally feeling inclined for a little refreshment, adjourned to a hotel hard by, where they proceeded to fight their battles over again under the cheerful influence of the flowing bowl. Little did they dream, while thus discussing the day's play, that the Kelso larrikins were busy with brush and paint, effecting a complete change in the colour of the horses in the adjoining field. Imagine the surprise of the Knights of the Willow when, after the shades of evening had descended, they proceeded to the paddock and found that they could not recognise their own horses, which were of a variety of colours very different from their natural hues. It was some time ere each rider was able to distinguish his own steed, but eventually the difficulty was overcome, and the party proceeded on their return journey, muttering anything but blessings on Kelso ingenuity.
The award-winning Heritage Matters is broadcast on the first Monday of each month at 9:30 a.m. and replayed on the following Sunday at 7 p.m. There are further replays on the third week of the month, Thursday at 1 p.m. and Sunday at 7 p.m. Or you can listen as a podcast from the Otago Access Radio website at oar.org.nz.
As Aotearoa New Zealand's national heritage agency, Heritage New Zealand Pohere Taonga is proud to sponsor Heritage Matters. Celebrate our heritage by becoming a member to visit more than 20 heritage places we care for across the motu for free. You'll receive a subscription to our award-winning magazine, exclusive member events, and free or discounted admission to over 1,000 international heritage places. Support the heritage of Aotearoa New Zealand. Check out visitheritage.co.nz.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.